Thank you very much for coming out this morning. It's nice to be back in La Crosse. It's been a while since I've been here. I'll explain in a few minutes one of the reasons I came here one year. But I'm here to talk about the book Badger Boneyards, The Eternal Rest of the Story, which is this book. I had this thing for cemeteries. Maybe one of my favorite little tombstones in Wisconsin is in a little cemetery in Fifield in northern Wisconsin where I live. And I was in the cemetery one day just poking around, and I came across the grave of a man named James Boyer. And it listed his date of birth as July 29th, 1933. And the stone read, "In 1958, a contest was held to find the meanest woman in the world. Alas, I married the winner and the runner-up with affection. But if either is buried next to me in this lot, there is going to be a resurrection." I have no idea what that was about. And there was no date of death, so I suppose I could have called him up and said, "Mr. Boyer, you got some explaining to do. What is this about?" Last year, my wife and I were passing through Fifield again, and I stopped to show her the marker, and this time there was a date of death. He had died within the last year. So it's too late to call him up and say, "What's this about?" I talked to the guy who was mowing grass in the cemetery, and he said he knew Mr. Boyer, and that he'd had 2 unhappy marriages, and I said, "Did he marry again?" And he said, "No, he did not." But that's just a marvelous stone for some reason he spent money to have that carved and left that as his epitaph, so I was amused. This book on cemeteries came about after I left the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel in 2007. I could sort of see where things were going in the newspaper business, so I took a buyout. And after I did, I got a call at home from Kathy Borkowski, who was the publisher, the editor, chief editor at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. And she said, "Can I take you to lunch?" And we did. We went to the University Club in Madison. And at lunch she said, "Do you have any book ideas we might be interested in?" And this kind of surprised me, but I said, "Well, I always wanted to write a book called Badger Boneyards, The Eternal Rest of the Story." And she looked at me like that really wasn't what she was expecting to hear. But she said, "Well, send us a couple of chapters." And I said, "It's not, I'm not profiling cemeteries. I'm just telling stories that all involve a cemetery in some way." And she said, "Well, send a couple chapters and we'll talk about it." And so I did that, and I didn't hear anything for almost 6 months. Finally, she called again one day and said, "We'd like to publish your book." And I said, "Great, I better go write it." So I proceeded to hit the road again and collect these stories, some of which I had written for the newspaper in the past, and I redid. It really surprised even me when I started doing some research, and I was able to find almost every story I'd ever written that included a cemetery in some way. And there were a lot of them. I guess I went to that well very often. But I just, as I said in the preface of the book, it was just a place where I found a lot of good stories. Some years ago, while in Atlanta on important newspaper business, and yes, there is still such a thing, I noticed in a visitor guide that one of the greatest amateur golfers ever, Bobby Jones, was buried in historic Oakland Cemetery. This interested me for 2 reasons. One, I play golf. Jones, in addition to his spectacular playing career, founded the Masters Tournament, which is played every year at Augusta National Golf Club in Georgia. He was an iconic figure in the game. And on another occasion, some friends and I had once spent an afternoon trying quite unsuccessfully to find the Atlanta house where Jones had lived. I told Dale, the photographer I was traveling with, that we had to add Oakland Cemetery to our itinerary. Dale was not a golfer. He looked at me as if the fever had claimed my mind. It took 2 days to persuade him I was serious, but on our last day he agreed we could swing through the cemetery on our way to the airport. When we did, we found Jones's grave, mowed short and tight as a putting green, and graced with 18 specimens of plants, 1 for each hole at Augusta National Golf Course. Dale was less than reverent. Instead of a hole in one, he said, "He's the one in a hole." But I briefly paid respects. On top of housing the grave of Robert Jones, Oakland was a spectacular cemetery. I'm sorry, some politician probably. Oakland was a spectacular cemetery, a quiet city of some 70,000 residents. with sections for Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers, a potter's field with 17,000 graves, a section for former slaves, a Jewish section, even a marker for Tweet the Mockingbird. There was so much grand Victorian funerary architecture as to put Oakland Cemetery on the National Register of Historic Places. On the way out, I saw a sign pointing to the grave of Margaret Mitchell of Gone with the Wind fame, and asked Dale if we shouldn't stop there as well. Frankly, he said, I don't give a damn. I forgave him that, but I surely didn't agree. Cemeteries have long held an interest for me, which may be odd given my intention to one day be cremated, and nice coincidence here, Gone with the Wind. I sometimes mowed grass in a small cemetery in a town settled by Norwegian immigrants. And like row after row of stones with Norwegian names was a marker for one lonely Irishman named Louis Kelly, an oddity I once wove into a newspaper column when I discovered Shamrock, Wisconsin. As a traveling newspaper man, I often found stories in cemeteries the way political reporters find them at City Hall, or sports reporters find them in a gym. In Taos, New Mexico, I stood at the grave of Kit Carson, whose frontier exploits had intrigued me as a child. In Key West, Florida, I went early one morning to the historic cemetery where the dead are buried both above and below ground to see the monument of the USS Maine and the famous headstone of B.P. Pearl Roberts, who was said to have been a hypochondriac. Her husband ordered a marker that read, I told you I was sick. In Savannah, Georgia, visiting Bonaventure Cemetery was as much a must-do as trying the specialty called she-crab soup, and it's hard to say which I savored more. Bonaventure is the gorgeous, atmospheric burial place made widely famous in John Barrett's Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, but it had been discovered long before that. John Muir, after spending 5 days camping there in 1867, declared it so beautiful that almost any sensible person would choose to dwell here with the dead rather than with the lazy, disorderly living. It might sound funny to say the dead have inspired a lot of stories for me, but it's true. There are thousands of cemeteries in Wisconsin, large and small, tiny and neglected, so old the headstones can't tell their stories, and so new that the ground is still wet with the tears of mourners. For every sprawling city of the dead, such as Milwaukee's Forest Home Cemetery, with more than 100,000 burials, there is a bedroom-sized family plot on a country road. In either case, and in every cemetery in between, where the dead rest, history lives. I probably wrote enough stories about cemeteries in various columns that people started to associate me with the subject, and so I would get tips from readers. And one of them was, if you ever get up around the Wisconsin border, around Norway, Michigan, which is just over the border, stop at the cemetery and meet Digger. So one year I was up in that area, and I called Digger the night before and said, can I come and see your cemetery? And he said yes, and he had such a wonderful UP accent that I went and bought a tape recorder so that I could just record him. And it turned out to be a column that I'm still very pleased with. It's called An Old-Time Cemetery Man. This story comes from about 6 feet over the Wisconsin-Michigan border, but no artificial boundary should get in the way of a good cemetery tale. Someone once told me when I got to this area, I should slip across the border and visit Digger. Digger is really Ed Wenzel, also called Billy. He was 76 when we met in the early 1990s, and might truly be called the last of a dying breed, a small-town sexton who knows where the bodies are buried because he buried them. When I called to say I was coming, I was struck by Digger's distinctive UP accent, so I bought a tape recorder. Digger was wearing a cap and work clothes when I arrived, but with no immediate need to arrange for another permanent lodger, he had time to show me around the piney setting where he worked. Just as an aside, I was also struck when I found all those old stories at how many times I used the expression, a piney setting. I must have thought it was original every time. I'd been told to ask Digger about the old days, so I did. 1937, he said, April the 1st, 1937. When I walked up here the first day, it was really like a son of a gun. You had to walk 4 miles. There was no cars them days. There was no building, nothing. Just a little old shed down in a hole. They had a wheelbarrow, a shovel, and a rake. That's all they had. Steel wheel, too. You had to dig everything by hand and then wheel everything to the woods by wheelbarrow, because there's half the grave left over. Anybody with common sense knows that. Like I said, you had no place to eat, no shed. 30 below, you had to come out and dig. You had to shovel the snow by hand, no snow blow, all with a scoop shovel. Then I started to plow with a truck without no windows. That's how I froze my face. I got $1.50 a day, and the other guys got $1.25. I got a quarter more because I took the foreman's job. I did it all, take care of the books, the whole damn thing. And I was never a bookkeeper, I was a grave digger, and I told them that. Now I get, well, I shouldn't put salaries in there. We only get $325 here for digging a grave. They get $600 and $800 over in Iron Mountain. See, we don't have no backhoe. We could have one, but to me it don't seem feasible. It's only sand, you know. We dig them all by hand. A couple of hours in the sand and we dig in a hole, and an hour after we're done, you couldn't even tell where they was buried. We dig them all year round. I dug it 30 below. You got to pound with a hammer and maul and dig them. When you're young, you can go like heck. Like I said, it's sand. But like I said, it ain't easy. And I hate to say it, but if I hadn't ever stayed here, they wouldn't have a cemetery like it is. I don't want to brag about myself, but I know because I keep it up like I keep up my yard at home. But I'm only one man and I'm getting older. I can't cut the mustard like I used to, because I fell off the roof 5 years ago and about killed myself. My wife rolled me over, and I heard her long miles away saying, "Eddie, your father's gone, I think. I think your father is gone. Go call the ambulance. I think your poor old father is dead." But then I started to roll a bit. She said, "Oh, Lord Almighty, he's starting to move." A woman the other day said, "I never thought you'd be back digging holes again. You were pretty well battered." I broke my arm and my collarbone and my pelvis, but I got out of the damn bed and came back and dug again. You got to be a cemetery man. You got to be dedicated. You got to go with the weather. When there's snow, you know, or a goddamn rainstorm, you got to be out there. You got to get that thing in the ground. If the man says the funeral is 10 o'clock Tuesday, it's 10 o'clock Tuesday. Even though you are dead, you are on time. We sat for a while in the sexton's office where large historic photos served as the decor. And he went on, "Oh yeah, all the miners from that top picture up there, I buried the whole damn bunch of them. Even the widows now, because that's 55 years now, don't forget. See, all these younger guys, this kid will be in here in a little while. Funny, he ain't here already. They're dead, all these guys. My father, my mother, my brothers I did. I dug my mother's on a Sunday. I dug all my relations too. It never bothered me. Yesterday I buried my classmate. When someone calls up and says so-and-so's dead, you feel kind of funny. You get used to it. It's like anything else. Years ago, I done all the digging, but now I get Eddie and the kids. They like that, see? But I know when I'm gone, the day I walk out of here, they're going to go mechanized. I know they are. We drove through the cemetery where I met a host of dead people. The first grave I dug was right there, Billy would say, a man at peace with his accomplishments. He is at home here, and like a good cemetery man, he has planned ahead. His stone is in place, and he knows who will open the earth to receive him. Eddie, he said, like father, like son. The money I spent on the tape recorder, on expense account, of course, was so valuable because I was able to turn that into a little bit of an oral history. And I just really enjoyed meeting Bigger. So that was a special day. I'm going to show you some various slides now and just kind of talk a little bit about where we are. This is a cemetery in Sauk City, Wisconsin. It's the Andrew Roll Free Congregational Cemetery. It was founded in the 1800s to serve a community of free thinkers. This was an organization that had begun in Germany and brought to America, and the movement spread quite rapidly. There were at one time 26 freethinker communities in Wisconsin. They were not atheists necessarily. They were not anti-religious, but they were assuredly anti-clerical. So this congregation established the cemetery, and one of the rules was that no priest or minister should ever enter the grounds. They ruled themselves. They were lay people. They believed that the lay people were vessels to be filled, but not with priests and ministers, because Catholic and Protestants had their own agendas, and they just didn't want any part of that. They were free thinkers. Some in the community accepted that. It was quite a prominent group of people, but others rejected them as atheists. One of them was pretty offended one day when the minister wouldn't even wave from his wagon as he went by. But the community prospered. They established a Freethinker Hall. There were a couple of hundred of these communities across the country. I guess congregation would be the word. This was the only one that survived to this day. There was a prominent one in Milwaukee, big German population there, of course. But the one in Sauk City has changed. It is now affiliated with Unitarian Universalism, but it still welcomes all sorts of people, believers and non-believers in deity. But the hall is still used. They celebrate Thomas Paine's birthday, celebrate freedom, and the cemetery is still in use. The beautiful trees you see around it were saplings that they brought over from the Wisconsin River in Baraboo and planted, and so now they've come of age themselves. The guy in charge of the community, when I talked to him, said there have been ministers on the grounds sometimes in the past, so it's not a rigid rule anymore, but it's the only one that I was ever aware of that was established with that in mind. This is just an example of what I find about walking through a cemetery, some of the things you find. This was in a cemetery in Door County, and we noticed that all around us, all of the markers were for children. So we were in a children's corner of the cemetery. And as I called and checked on it, and what happened was it was a Catholic cemetery. And these were the kids who had died before they were baptized. So they couldn't be buried in consecrated ground with their families. They were buried in a set-off area, which I found very sad. This is the White Star Church, also in Door County. And the White Star Church was a psychic science community. This was established after the Civil War. Psychic science was a belief that you could talk to the dead. Mrs. Lincoln was among the believers. She tried to communicate with her deceased son in the White House. But this community was in Door County, and they established a cemetery that I went to. Because of the water table in Door County, they had to move it to another place. It still exists today. And I thought if you were into psychic science, I could go to the cemetery and be able to communicate with the people. Well, I wasn't able to do that. I think maybe if I don't come with the right set of beliefs, that's not possible. They still do meet, at least during warm weather. Because if you see back there in the corner, there's the outhouse. And I was sort of amused that the Psychic Science Church now has its own website, which struck me as a little incongruous. They ought to know just when they're meeting off. Anyway.
Where in Door County is that?
It's in southern Door County. I'd have to double check. This again is another example of what they call Victorian funerary architecture. The heralds blowing their horns. There's a whole glossary of terms that you find associated with markers. A beautiful cemetery like Forest Home in Milwaukee has almost all the examples of that. Sometimes there's a cut-off stump of wood, meaning that was a life that was interrupted in midlife. There's various images on markers that will tell a story. Again, there are some that reflect the children or the different age of the people. Forest Home is a beautiful museum-like cemetery. It's called Historic Forest Home. And this image on the cover of this large mausoleum is the grave of the Frederick Pabst family, the brewing family. All of the prominent Milwaukee brewers, not the baseball team, but the beer makers, are buried in the same area. It's called Brewer's Rest or Brewer's Corner or something like that. But there was always a competition in the Victorian times for the largest markers. And Val Blatz won that. He's got a marker about 200 tons. It's a small room-sized marker. My friend John Gerda, who wrote the history of this cemetery, also notes that there are a lot more people buried there who drank Pabst and Schlitz than who got rich making it. But it is a marvelous place to go for a walk and just explore the architecture. It was developed at the time when parks were beginning to be thought of as when cemeteries were beginning to be thought of as parks with an alternate purpose. And so it's got winding streets, it's got little ponds, and it was built, it used to be that 5,000 or 6,000 people would come out on a Sunday and picnic and take walks in that park. And it's still a wonderful place to do it. There's a lot of big cemeteries in Wisconsin where that same thing can happen. This is the opposite of a big cemetery. This is right on Highway 42 in Door County, outside of a Belgian church. And the story is the Belgian church needed to build a parking lot. And the cemetery was out in front of the church, right where they wanted to put the parking lot. So they took the markers and put them in this little plot off to the side. And so when you stand there, you can read the names, all these old immigrant-sounding Belgian names on the markers, but it feels like you're standing at the cemetery, the smallest bunch of people ever buried. It's quite striking, and it's kind of, I mean, I turned around when I was standing there and I looked and I had parked in the parking lot on top of the people. It's a very, very unusual situation, but it's right next to a tavern that serves Belgian beers and Belgian chocolates. So it's worth visiting someday when you want a different experience. This is, I call them the talkative Cameron tombstones. And again, this is one that somebody called me up or sent me a note or something and told me about these two cemeteries, two tombstones. It's in Walworth County, and I just have to find, just bear with me for just a second here. You know, because of COVID, I haven't given this talk in a long time, so I kind of have to reacquaint myself with some of these things. As I say, it's nice to be back out with telling stories again. So this is in Little Prairie in Waukesha County, and I call them the talkative Cameron tombstones. This is the one for Duncan Cameron. The one next to him was for his uncle, James Cameron. He died at age 86 and was buried in that cemetery. And the birth and death math on his marker add up to only 85, but that's enough mystery, because he also listed on his marker the entire terms of his pension. It says, International Harvester Company, pension certificate. This is to certify that John D. Cameron, upon retirement from active duty, was awarded a pension in recognition of long, faithful, and efficient service through a period of 41 years and 1 month. This certificate is not transferable or assignable. Dated in Chicago, Illinois, the 15th day of September, 1931, Alex Legge, President. And that's curious enough that he would put the terms of his pension on his stone. You know, was it simple pride that he was proud of having a nice long career like that? Was it to thank maybe the company for giving a pension that his wife then could enjoy? Or was it saying, I can't take it with me, but I'll take it as far as I can? I don't know. You just don't know about those things. But right next to him is this marker for Duncan Cameron, who died, if you can make it out, at just 24, his nephew. And on the front of his stone it reads his accomplishments. James Wadsworth Grade School, Chicago, Illinois, 1911. Hyde Park High School, Michigan University, Ann Arbor, Michigan. Received degree of Bachelor of Arts. Nice accomplishments, 24 years old. Then you go around to the back of the stone and they were just getting started. Enrolled as Boy Scout of America in 1911. Remember, Delta Tau Delta fraternity. Life member, University of Michigan Union, 1918. Member, United States Naval Reserve, 1918. Assistant instructor in navigation, University of Michigan. Member, University of Michigan faculty. Special assistant for war courses in electrical engineering. Assistant manager, University of Michigan varsity football team. Member of the American Legion, Michigan. Urban Pre-Scout post, number 48. Griffins, University of Michigan All-Campus Society elective. The Druids, University of Michigan Senior Literary Society. Enrichment member of Alumni Association of the University of Michigan, and business manager of the Michigonian, the annual yearbook of the University of Michigan. All inscribed, they paid a stone cutter to put all of that on the back of the stone. You know, you think, why would you do that? It turned out that he had gotten sick and did die at age 24. So apparently, all I could find out was that they just wanted to remember what this short life was all about, that he did have a lot of things to be proud of. It's just one of the more curious markers I've ever seen, and it was, I really couldn't find too much about it except that when he died, he was brought there and buried with his uncle, and that's what they decided. So the stones match, the markers are identical except for the content on them. But it's one of those great delights you find when you just walk through a cemetery. And I still thank the person who directed me there. This is just a great intersection. Dead end and Cemetery Road. The interesting thing was that there's also the Catholic Church on the same road, but it's not Church Road, it's the Cemetery Road because the cemetery was outside the church. Until I saw this one, my favorite intersection in Wisconsin was near Bondwell, a little place called Slab City, where if you're going south, you can turn right onto Hope Lane or left onto Dump Road. And I always thought that was an interesting choice, but this is even better. It's kind of triply redundant if you think about it. This is the Eastman Cemetery, and this is I mentioned the La Crosse Public Library inspired this story. One of the things that used to please me most when I was traveling around and writing columns was getting up in the morning, leaving a house, not knowing where I was going or what I'd find, but coming home with something that I was really happy to have discovered. So I left my home one day and I was driving and I came to La Crosse and I sat in the public library reading a local history by Meyer Katz. And I came across the account of Emma Eastman. And I started reading and I was just fascinated with the story of Emma. She was the first white woman to be married in the city of La Crosse. But by then it was already her fourth marriage. She had come from Ohio with her family. And Katz went on to relate the story of Emma. She was quite a colorful character. She used to ride around town carrying a rifle. She spoke Indian language, so she was able to, at one point they said, stave off some unrest because she could communicate. She had a habit of getting married, not always a habit of getting divorced as well. She was married to one fellow who had wanted to divorce her on the grounds of adultery, and he was going to come back and hang her, but it would nasty a perfectly good rope, so he didn't do that. But anyway, this Katz account said that she was buried in a queer necropolis in McGregor, Iowa, with 6 of her 9 husbands. And I said, that's better than anything else I'll find today. So I got in the car and went down to McGregor. And I was approaching McGregor, Iowa, and I thought, I don't know where this cemetery is. I don't know this queer necropolis, as you called it. So I went to the public library in McGregor and asked the librarian if she knew anything about this woman, Emma Eastman. And she smiled and looked and she pointed to a mural on the wall. And there was a woman in a long dark dress, holding flowers and looking forlorn, surrounded by 9 markers, grave markers, for her 9 husbands. And I said, you know about Emma, that's wonderful. So she gave me directions out to the cemetery. The Eastman Cemetery is on private property on a farm in the country. And I was able to go there and find it. As it turns out, she's only buried with her last 3 husbands. It almost doesn't disappoint the story. And they called her the Virgin M because of these repeated marriages. And I said it was like the way you call a big man tiny. You know, she was quite a character. So she's buried with her last 3 husbands, including the one that survived her somehow. One of them, the one in La Crosse, actually spent time in prison for killing a man. She shot his brother over a dispute over some records and took an ad in the paper to defend herself, and she was not in prison for it. So she had quite a colorful life, old Emma did, but she's buried there now. The cemetery has been restored by a scout group, and it's even though it's on private property, you can go there and see this. It's just, there's an account of her life by a man who was also fascinated with the story, and so I called him up, and he was originally from McGregor. And he kind of filled me in on some of the details on her life. And I said, what did you think of Emma? And he said, well, I think maybe today we would call her schizophrenic because of the behaviors that kind of swung back and forth. But by all accounts, she was a beautiful woman. And he said, I probably wouldn't have liked her. And I said, you would have married her. Everybody else did. And that was just one of those things you find. I was really pleased with that one. This is in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, this is the marker for the 350 or so nameless victims of the Peshtigo fire. 1871, fire swept through much of the north, It was dry, there was timber slash everywhere, and it was just a combustible period. The Peshtigo fire, as you may know, was on the same day as the Great Chicago Fire. Resulted in somewhere over 1,000 deaths. It was never known for sure. There were 75 single men in a rooming house. They were all lost. Families were lost. When they finally, many of them took refuge in the river, the Peshtigo River, including a priest who wrote the definitive account of the fire. And his tabernacle was in there, and they were able to rescue that from the water. But they established a cemetery in town for many of the victims. It is one of the most poignant cemeteries to walk through because typically when you go through a cemetery, it's all people who lived a long and full life. Well, this was all lives interrupted by this terrible event. The 350 who couldn't be identified are in a mass grave. Next to them, you'll see the stones, and there are both interpretive signs as well as the markers, information on the markers. So when you go through, it tells the story of some of the victims of the fire. There was a man who rushed home to save his family, and he hitched up the wagon in a hurry and took off with his family, but he must not have hitched it properly because he had to stop and try and fix it. A ball of flame rolled over and killed everyone in the wagon. Accounts like that throughout the walk in the cemetery. There's a little museum next to it, but the cemetery tells as much of a story as any museum could. There was one guy who died 10 years later, and he was still listed as a victim of the Peshtigo fire, which was interesting. You could be a victim of that fire even if you survived it for a while. The state of Wisconsin started its historic roadside signs, and this was the very first one established. It's one of the most historic spots in Wisconsin because it remembers one of the biggest tragedies in Wisconsin history. This is in Spring Green, Wisconsin, outside of Unity Chapel. This is the grave of Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright was, of course, the famous architect, worked in Spring Green, and this is just down the hill from Taliesin. It's in the cemetery where his mother was also buried, and his mistress, who died in Peshtigo, in Spring Green. Frank Lloyd Wright then married again and moved on. When he died, it was his wish to be brought back. And he was in Arizona when he died with his then wife, Giovanna, and so he was brought back. He was met at the train station, and they taken by horse carriage to the cemetery and buried. And it's really a distinctive marker. It's the glass and steel on the bottom and that cut stone, very handsome. But if you go there to pay your respects, you really have to speak up because he's not there anymore. Old Giovanna, the original plan was that when she died, she was much younger, she would be brought there and buried with him. And she changed her mind later on and said she didn't want to come back to Spring Green, she wanted to be in Arizona. So she prevailed upon members of the Frank Lloyd Wright Fellowship to get Frank and bring him to her. Well, they knew that that would cause an uproar to take him from Wisconsin, so they basically spirited him away at night. Dug him up, brought him away. Word broke about this, the story broke, and there were just cries of outrage that his body was being disturbed, that he needed to be in the Wyoming Valley that had nurtured and inspired him for so long, this beloved son of the Spring Green area. Well, they sort of forgot that in real life a lot of them hated him because he didn't pay his bills and all of that other stuff, but the legislature demanded the return of the body of Frank Lloyd Wright. That was ignored. The fellowship was accused of grave robbing, and it was quite a firestorm for a little while, but he was never returned.
What year was that?
What
year did they steal him?
The 1950s. I'd have to double check and look, and I could do that if you But yeah, it was. It might have been the 60s before they brought him out of there. But it was, you still can go there and see the marker, and they don't tell you on the tour that he's not there. If you know it, that's fine. But Frank is elsewhere, so he and Old Giovanna are together in Arizona. Just the fun of walking through a cemetery. This is a Native American cemetery near Green Bay, Oneida area. One of the things that's distinctive about this cemetery, a couple of things. It's the most beautiful setting. It's on a hillside with this commanding view. And it's always interested me that so many cemeteries are put in beautiful places as if it's going to make a difference to the people who are buried there. But there was a guy who was cutting grass, and he said that people will actually come out with a book and sit and read because it's such a beautiful place. But the markers are also distinctive because a lot of them are personalized. There are dream catchers on some, or native images, bear, deer. They would have nicknames on there. This is Roy Kenneth McCann. He's got the carved bears and the flag, and it indicates he's a veteran. Many of the graves have the veteran insignias. The warrior tradition is strong in Native American communities. But it's a wooden marker that says, "Listen to me just once." And I love that because you don't know who he's saying that to. Is that to his wife or his children or to the government? It was clearly somebody who didn't think that his wisdom was enjoyed satisfactorily in real life. So he put it on the marker, "Listen to me just once." And so I did, and I still don't know what it's all about, but it was fun. This is in Rhinelander. John Heisman, the namesake of the Heisman Trophy, buried in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. He was mostly associated with the New York Athletic Club. He was one of the founders of football rules. He came up with a lot of the rules that contributed to football safety because people used to literally die playing early football because they didn't have safety equipment, for example, helmets, and he introduced a lot of that. The athletic club started offering a trophy every year for the best football player in the country, and it came to be called the Heisman Trophy because of John Heisman. When he died, his second wife was from Rhinelander. So they brought him to Rhinelander and buried him in the cemetery, in the woods, in a piney setting, if you'll bear with me again. And this marker is just flush to the ground, and it doesn't say it's that John Heisman. So I went there, and again, I called up the sexton and chatted about this a little bit. He said every year around the time of the Heisman Trophy, people come to see the grave of John Heisman, who has that little connection. It surprises so many people to know that this guy is so associated with New York, is buried in Rhinelander, but that's the reason. He said that one year, somebody came and put a mason jar on the grave with some football tickets, but they never got used. And then I found out that they were for a Minnesota game, which explains exactly everything. But John Heisman is there. There's a little marker, this marker in the cemetery, and there's a little display in the Rhinelander airport that indicates he's there. So if you fly into Rhinelander, and I'm not sure who does that, you might know about John Heisman being there. But other than that, there's nothing that calls attention to him. And it's also thought that no Heisman Trophy winner has ever come to see the grave. After Ron Dane got the Heisman, some friends of mine said that they were going to try and get him up there. They were involved in the university football fandom community, but to my knowledge, they never did. So the first one who shows up, the next one who shows up will be the first. This is in Peninsula State Park. There are, as it happens, 4 burial places within the grounds of Peninsula State Park in Door County. Blossomburg Cemetery is the community cemetery. It's got some really cool markers. The former sheriff's stone is in the shape of Door County, which takes careful cutting. But this marker is on the golf course. It's surrounded by that little fence. And it's the burial place of Chief Simon Kekwatos, who was an Indian from Wisconsin. He died, he had been in Door County for the erection of an early totem pole, he and some others from his tribe in Forest County. And at the time he was asked if he would like to be buried there, which was the traditional land of his people, and he said he would like to do that. So at the time of his death, they arranged to have this taken care of. And Door County being Door County, they put him on ice for a few months until it was spring so that they could have this burial outside, and brought him there. They dressed him in a coat that he had worn to Washington to negotiate for his people, and a few other things to help him on his journey, and buried him under this totem pole. The totem pole was the creation of one of Door County's promoters who thought it would be nice, even though totem poles were not associated with the Potawatomi in any way. That's a Western thing. But Simon was put under this totem pole, and some of his friends objected to the idea that he be buried on a golf course. It's the only golf course I've ever been on where you get relief if you hit it near the totem pole where the Indian is buried. But it's a pretty distinctive marker. This again is one of the little surprises you can sometimes encounter when you go through a cemetery. These beautiful little mysteries. This woman had just been buried a few years before shortly before I got there actually, 2008 as you can see, and her leg braces are leaning against the marker. No idea, again, what that was all about. You know, she's happy that she didn't need them anymore, that she was free of these encumbrances, or what the message in that was. But it's just this neat little mystery as you're walking through. And this is in Wisconsin Dells. This is the burial place of Belle Boyd. Belle Boyd was a Confederate spy, quite a prominent Confederate spy at the time. She was from Virginia. She was said to be a beautiful young woman, had the best legs in the Confederacy by one account. I'm not sure how anyone knew that with the dresses she wore, but she worked at a rooming house that her mother owned. And some of the Northern officers were staying in that rooming house, and she would eavesdrop on their conversations and carry the information that she gathered to Southern generals. She once famously ran across the battlefield with her bonnet flying behind her to alert Stonewall Jackson to some Union troop movements. She was very prominent in the cause. She was arrested a couple of different times and jailed, and she would sing Confederate songs through the jail window. She eventually married a couple of times, in fact, always to Northerners, as it happened. And after the war, she kind of developed a little interest in show business, and she had a one-woman show that was all about her exploits in the war. It was called Belle Boyd in War and Peacetime or something like that. And she took it on the road. And she happened to be in a little town called Kilbourne City, which was the original name of Wisconsin Dells, when she died. And for some reason, she was buried in Kilbourne City instead of being taken back to wherever she called home in those days. And so she's buried right at the outskirts of Wisconsin Dells. Same cemetery with H.H. Bennett, the great landscape photographer who's associated with the Dells and promoted it so heavily. This marker is quite substantial, as you can see. It's got the brick base, the stone, and the cement. And at the time I was there, it was the stars and bars were flying next to the grave. It turns out that the Daughters of the Confederacy in Virginia contacted the American Legion 60-some years ago, 70 years ago now, and they asked the man who raised the American flag at the cemetery on Memorial Day if he would also raise the stars and bars in honor of Belle Boyd, who was buried there. And in turn, they would place a wreath on the grave of Wisconsin soldiers who had died in Virginia and were buried there. And so the man, his name was Oliver Reese, he happened to be H.H. Bennett's son-in-law, said he would do that. And so he did it that year, he did it the next year, and for the next 50 years, he would always raise both flags on Memorial Day. So sometime after the 2000s, the Daughters of the Confederacy came to Wisconsin Dells to thank him, and they held a picnic. They took a boat ride on the river on the boat called the Belle Boyd. It's one of the tour boats, and they thanked Mr. Reese for all of these years of service to Belle Boyd, and then his son and daughter-in-law took over the obligation of doing that. I haven't been back. I'd like to sometime to see if there is still the Confederate flag, because there's been a great reckoning with Confederate images in this country. And I'd be surprised if that's still there. There's another cemetery in Madison, a wonderful cemetery on the west side, where there's a section for Confederate soldiers who died when Camp Randall was a prison camp. There's about 160 graves in an area called Confederate Rest. And there's a marker out in front that recalled their heroism and everything else. Well, the city of Madison has taken that away because these were involved in a revolution against the country. So they've reckoned with that, but the markers are still there. The individual graves are still there, all young men from various southern states. And it's kind of a neat piece of history to walk through Confederate Rest in this otherwise large cemetery that has the marker of every prominent Madisonian whose name is on a campus building or a government or anything else. And these Confederate soldiers were buried next to them. So I don't know if that Confederate flag is still there, but at the time that was just quite striking to see this cemetery. And that's my old car in the background. So. Anyway, that's my brief synopsis of Badger Boneyards. Do we have a couple of minutes for questions, I think, if anybody has any questions for me? Yes?
When you started out your presentation, you said there was a stone that said, I told you I was sick?
Yes.
Was that at Woodlawn Cemetery here?
There's probably more than one, but that particular one is in Key West, Florida.
There's one in Woodlawn as well.
Okay, yeah, I think that it's one of the more famous stories about cemeteries, so I can see people taking the same thing.
And then also, when you were talking about grave diggers, my parents are buried in Ettrick,
Okay.
the Catholic cemetery, and a lady just passed away. And my brother happened to be visiting. This is in like the last 5 weeks or so. This gravedigger's wife passed away, and my brother went to visit our sites, and he was there digging the grave for his wife.
Oh, jeez, yeah.
So it's still going on.
Oh, it is.
He was in his 80s.
I live in Mayfield, and they still dig graves by hand. John Johnson digs them.
He was there with his brother and a couple shovels. That's what my
Wow,
brother said.
that's pretty poignant too. That's a good story.
So.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question. What's your book? A Boneyard. What's the name of the book?
Badger Boneyards.
Badger Boneyard. And your slide presentations on pictures, like bracelets. And people's names that are not personal and reasons. Did you have to have permission from the families or, I mean?
No, they're public.
Okay.
Any cemetery is a public place, and so you can take pictures. I've never encountered any reason to ask for permission. I usually would talk to the sexton or somebody so they knew what I was doing, and yeah. Well, it's a funny thing because I was looking at a cemetery once. I'd heard about a grave it's in southwest Wisconsin, and I was walking through the cemetery looking for the marker of a woman who put her weight on her marker. And she listed her weight at 400 pounds. And I walked up every row twice and never found that marker. So I don't know if someone stole it or why, but I really wanted to find that marker and never could. But yeah, people do funny things. This is the public service pitch I make. If you want to make a mark later on, think about what you'll do with your own. Tell a story if you want to, or leave a mystery, or have some fun with it. But it's your last chance. It's last words, so. Yes?
Is there anyone here who will cross cemeteries unusual?
Unusual, I don't know offhand unusual. The victims of the War Eagle would be certainly historic burials. I wrote about that in a different book, but I don't know, there probably is, I just don't know. And it's not every time that I walk through a cemetery I found something that really jumps out either, because there are a lot of times when it's just ordinary graves, but when you do find something that delights you, that's really a special thing. Yes?
In central Illinois, along the Illinois River, up in the hills, I'm hiking with my girlfriends, we had some property there. We're up in the hills, we come to this completely abandoned cemetery, and there's a marker there with the Pythagorean theorem drawn on it.
Really?
And I have a picture of that somewhere, because I don't remember now the details of who it was, but it was just the strangest thing.
Yeah.
Because, there's no community there anymore, and very old cemetery, and
That's kind of cool, actually.
yeah, I thought it was.
Yeah. Yes?
Before I moved to the cross, it's a lot colder in Wausau, and I was a runner, and I would go to the cemetery there, and in the winter they put fires on top of the ground where they were going to dig the graves. So that was always interesting. I would run 20 degrees below and get fire out in the cemetery.
They're getting the frost out of the ground so they can dig, yeah. Still down, yes?
You didn't have time to mention everything, I'm sure, but north-south and east-west.
Yeah.
And he wanted to look upon Tallahassee, and it was kind of a scandal in the neighborhood.
That he's married in the wrong direction?
Yes,
Ah.
because you're supposed to see the Lord as you, when he comes.
Correct.
And he wanted to see Tallahassee.
He considered himself the Lord anyway, so. There's another cemetery, I think it's in Sauk County, where the Germans were buried in one direction and the Irish in another. And they wouldn't put them in accord in any way. So. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. I do have books here from not only this book, but some others that I've written, including one on the Mississippi River. And I always like to point out that nothing says Merry Christmas like a book signed by the author. So if you're interested, I'm here. Thank you.